Hollywood's golden age sparkled with glitz, glamour, and stars larger than life. But behind the tuxedos and red carpets, some of those stars carried experiences far darker than their roles ever revealed. These weren't just actors. They were trained fighters, men who stared death in the face long before they stood in front of a camera. Did you know your favorite screen idol once survived real combat? Let's pull back the curtain and uncover the shocking stories. James Stewart. James Stewart always looked like the small-town boy next door, the kind of man you could trust to deliver a heartfelt speech on Main Street. But don't let that soft drawl fool you. Stewart wasn't just a star of It's a Wonderful Life. He was a battle-tested pilot who led men into the skies over Nazi Germany. When World War II broke out, Stewart didn't hide behind Hollywood contracts. He joined the United States Army Air Corps, pushing to become a combat pilot despite studio executives begging him not to. By 1943, he was flying B-24 Liberators as a squadron commander. This wasn't symbolic duty. Stewart led actual bombing runs deep into enemy territory, with anti-aircraft fire tearing through the skies and the real chance he wouldn't make it home. The missions were brutal. Entire squadrons could vanish in a single day. Stewart, who would eventually fly 20 combat missions, carried the weight of sending young men into battles that had no guarantees. And while most actors played heroes on the big screen, Stewart earned real decorations for courage, including the Distinguished Flying Cross. After the war, he returned to acting, but the war never left him. His performances gained a gravity that audiences felt. When Stewart played men torn between duty and conscience, it wasn't just acting, it was lived truth. He later rose to Brigadier General in the Air Force Reserve, making him one of the highest-ranking actors in military history. James Stewart wasn't just a leading man. He was the real deal, a commander who had faced the fire and lived to tell the tale. Audie Murphy. If Hollywood ever needed a real-life action hero, it was Audie Murphy. Standing just 5'5" and weighing barely 110 pounds when he enlisted, he didn't look like much. But appearances can be deceiving. Murphy went from dirt-poor Texas farm boy to the most decorated American soldier of World War II before he was even old enough to buy a drink. Murphy wasn't just brave, he was fearless. His Medal of Honor came after a moment that defied logic. In France, 1945, his unit was under siege. Outnumbered, Murphy ordered his men to retreat while he stayed behind. He climbed onto a burning tank destroyer, manned its machine gun, and single-handedly held off waves of advancing troops for an hour. He was wounded in the leg, but refused to back down. When reinforcements finally arrived, Murphy led a counterattack. That wasn't a movie scene. That was reality. By war's end, Murphy had received every U.S. military combat award for valor, plus decorations from France and Belgium. He wasn't even 21. When he returned home, Hollywood came calling, eager to turn his story into film. He starred in To Hell and Back, playing himself in a chilling reenactment of his wartime experiences. Watching the movie, audiences weren't just seeing a performance. They were seeing the actual man who lived it. Murphy's career included dozens of westerns and dramas, but his war record always overshadowed his acting. He was a trained warrior first, an actor second. Audie Murphy proved that legends don't need capes or costumes. Sometimes, the toughest hero on screen is simply playing himself. Clark Gable. Clark Gable was the king of Hollywood, a man who owned the screen with charm and swagger. But when tragedy struck, Carole Lombard, his beloved wife, died in a plane crash. In 1942, Gable made a choice that shocked Hollywood. Instead of drowning in grief under studio lights, he enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. At an age when most actors stayed far from combat, Gable trained as a gunner and flew real missions over Europe. In 1943, he joined the 351st Bomb Group, where the odds of survival were terrifyingly slim. He wasn't riding along for photo ops. He manned a waist gun on B-17 flying fortresses, staring down enemy fighters and flak bursts that shredded planes mid-air. On one mission over Germany, his aircraft took heavy fire. Bullets tore through the fuselage, narrowly missing him. It was a moment that could have ended the king of Hollywood's reign forever. But Gable returned again and again, proving his courage wasn't just scripted. Even President Franklin D. Roosevelt reportedly worried about Gable's safety, fearing the loss of America's biggest movie star would crush morale. The Air Force eventually pulled him back from combat duty and reassigned him to filming training documentaries. But by then, Gable had already risked everything. When he returned to the screen, his movies carried a new weight. Behind the mustache and the grin was a man who had faced real danger. Clark Gable wasn't just Hollywood royalty. He was a fighter who traded his crown for a gunner's seat when his country needed him most. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas built a career on playing fierce, determined men, from gladiators to gunslingers. That toughness wasn't crafted in a studio. It came from real life. Before he became a movie legend, Douglas served in the United States Navy during World War II. He enlisted in 1941, working as a communications officer on patrol craft in the Pacific. It wasn't glamorous. His job placed him on ships patrolling waters infested with danger, where attacks could come at any moment. During one operation, Douglas narrowly avoided death when a Japanese kamikaze plane targeted his ship. The vessel took damage, men were injured, and Douglas saw firsthand the chaos of modern war. Those close calls stuck with him. Years later, Douglas admitted that his time in the Navy shaped not only his discipline, but also his relentless drive to succeed in Hollywood. He came home determined never to waste time, a fire that burned through his acting career. While Douglas didn't rack up medals like some of his peers, his willingness to serve and survive in dangerous waters proved his resilience. He carried that edge into roles like Spartacus, where his intensity felt almost too real. That was because it was. When audiences watched him lead men in rebellion or face down enemies, they weren't just watching an actor. They were watching someone who had already faced danger in the flesh. Kirk Douglas may have been sculpted into a star by Hollywood, but the core of his grit was forged in the Pacific. Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin was the ultimate tough guy. With his gravelly voice and scarred face, he looked like someone who had already lived a dozen lives before stepping onto a movie set. That wasn't far from the truth. Marvin wasn't just acting when he played hardened characters. He was drawing from brutal, real-life experience. He served in the United States Marine Corps, assigned as a scout and rifleman in the Pacific Theater. In 1944, he took part in the Battle of Saipan, one of the bloodiest clashes of the war. Marvin's unit was nearly wiped out. Out of 247 men, only a handful walked away. Marvin was among the wounded, taking a shot that punctured his sciatic nerve and left him hospitalized for more than a year. That injury ended his military career, but it gave him something else, an authenticity that Hollywood could never fake. When Marvin played battle-hardened soldiers or cynical outlaws, audiences believed him because he had been there. He knew the fear, the chaos, and the cost. After the war, Marvin drifted into acting almost by accident, but his presence was undeniable. Films like The Dirty Dozen and Cat Ballou showcased his ability to embody men who carried scars, both visible and hidden. Those scars weren't makeup. They were his. Marvin once said that his time in the Marines shaped everything about him: his outlook, his discipline, his refusal to take nonsense from anyone. On screen, that translated into raw power. Lee Marvin wasn't Hollywood's idea of a hero. He was the real deal. A man who had seen combat, survived devastation, and returned to tell his story through the roles he chose. Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson didn't look like the average Hollywood pretty boy. He had a hard face, a quiet intensity, and a presence that screamed survival. That's because Bronson's toughness was rooted in a life far removed from bright lights and sound stages. Before he became one of cinema's most recognizable tough guys, He flew into danger as part of the United States Army Air Forces during World War II. Bronson manned the tail guns of a B-29 Superfortress, one of the most dangerous positions in the air. Tail gunners were the last line of defense against enemy planes, often sitting alone in cramped, freezing compartments thousands of feet above the ground. The risks were immense, and the missions were relentless. Bronson flew multiple runs over Japan, staring danger in the face every time his bomber left the runway. Those experiences stayed with him. Bronson came from a background of poverty, so poor he once wore his sister's dress to school because he didn't have clothes of his own. That kind of upbringing, combined with his wartime service, created a man who could endure anything. When he later appeared in films like The Magnificent Seven or The Great Escape, his stoicism wasn't just acting. It was the real demeanor of a man who had survived near impossible odds. Audiences often sensed that authenticity. Bronson didn't need to shout or flex. He simply existed on screen, and people believed him. Every line, every stare carried the weight of someone who had lived through more than most could imagine. Charles Bronson wasn't manufactured toughness. He was forged in hardship and fire, and Hollywood just gave him a stage to show it. Henry Fonda. Henry Fonda always radiated integrity. Whether he was standing tall as Tom Joad in The Grapes of Wrath, or delivering quiet authority in 12 Angry Men, Fonda embodied a sense of decency. But his moral backbone wasn't just a Hollywood illusion. During World War II, Fonda left behind the glamour of acting to serve his country in the Navy. He volunteered as soon as America entered the war, insisting he didn't want to spend the conflict play-acting bravery on screen while others carried the burden. Fonda became a quartermaster on a destroyer in the Pacific, guiding ships through waters where sudden attacks were always a possibility. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. Fonda's service gave him a different kind of authority. He didn't command with flashy heroics. He performed the steady, disciplined work that kept his crew alive and his ship on course. That sense of quiet leadership mirrored the characters he would later bring to life. Audiences trusted him because he had earned trust in reality. After the war, Fonda returned to Hollywood with a sharper edge. His performances carried the weight of experience, a gravity that couldn't be faked. When he played leaders, judges, or men facing impossible decisions, the audience felt they were watching someone who had lived those pressures. Fonda proved that true strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it's measured in calm decisions under fire. That's what made him unforgettable, both as a serviceman and as one of Hollywood's most enduring legends. Richard Todd. Richard Todd wasn't just another British actor who found fame after the war. He was a man who helped make history before he ever stepped on a set. Todd was one of the very first British paratroopers to land in Normandy on D-Day. That's right, the man audiences later watched in The Dam Busters was actually storming Europe, while most of the world was still asleep. On June 6, 1944, Todd parachuted into occupied France as part of the 6th Airborne Division. His unit's mission was to secure Pegasus Bridge, a critical point that would allow Allied forces to move inland. The fighting was intense, and casualties were heavy. Todd not only survived the drop and the firefight, but he also played a key role in holding the bridge until reinforcements arrived. Years later, when Hollywood produced The Longest Day, Todd was cast in the film to portray a British officer. But here's the twist. He ended up acting alongside characters based on men he had actually fought beside during the invasion. Imagine reenacting one of the most pivotal nights of your life, this time for cameras instead of history books. Todd's military service shaped his entire career. He brought an authenticity to war films that few others could match, because he wasn't pretending. He had been there, with mud on his boots and danger at every corner. Richard Todd's story is proof that sometimes the best actors don't need to imagine heroism. They've already lived it. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power was one of Hollywood's most handsome leading men, a matinee idol who could light up any screen. But when the world went to war, Power walked away from superstardom and enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. Unlike some celebrities who were given safe posts, Power insisted on real duty. He trained as a pilot and flew transport missions in the Pacific Theater. His work wasn't about glamour. It was about moving supplies and evacuating the wounded from battle zones like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These were grueling missions, often under dangerous conditions, where landing strips were barely secure and attacks could happen at any time. Power's decision shocked Hollywood, but it also elevated his reputation. Audiences already adored him for his good looks and charm, but now they respected him for his courage. When he returned to the screen after the war, his roles carried a new depth. The light-hearted swashbuckler had become a man who understood sacrifice. Tragically, Power's life ended far too soon when he collapsed during filming in the 1950s. But his wartime service remains a powerful chapter in his legacy. He wasn't just a Hollywood heartthrob. He was a Marine who chose to trade the spotlight for the cockpit when the world needed him most. Neville Brand. Neville Brand isn't as well known today as some of his peers, but during his prime, he was one of Hollywood's most reliable tough guys. On screen, he often played heavies, menacing figures in westerns and crime dramas. Off-screen, he carried the kind of combat record that made even the toughest actors look tame. Before stepping into Hollywood, Brand fought in World War II as part of the United States Army. He served in Europe and quickly built a reputation for bravery under fire. By the end of the war, he was one of the most decorated American servicemen, earning the Silver Star for valor. He survived close-quarters battles and countless harrowing experiences, walking away with scars, both physical and emotional, that would never fully fade. When he turned to acting, Brand brought that raw intensity with him. Casting directors didn't need him to fake being tough. He simply had to walk into a room, and his presence spoke volumes. Audiences didn't always know his story, but they could sense it. His characters felt authentic, because the man playing them had lived through trials most could never imagine. Brand later admitted that the war had left deep marks on him, but he also credited it with shaping who he became. Without that background, he might never have found his niche in Hollywood. Neville Brand's career may not have reached superstar levels, but his real-life courage put him in a league of his own. He wasn't just pretending to be hard-edged. He was the genuine article. Sterling Hayden. Sterling Hayden was Hollywood's rugged giant, towering at 6'5" with a presence that commanded attention. But his most daring roles weren't on screen. They happened long before the cameras ever rolled. During World War II, Hayden didn't just enlist. He joined the Office of Strategic Services, the secretive unit that later evolved into the CIA. Hayden became a master of disguise and deception, smuggling weapons and supplies across treacherous waters in the Mediterranean. He worked with resistance fighters in Yugoslavia, often sailing small boats at night through seas crawling with danger. If he was captured, his story would have ended in silence. But Hayden had nerves of steel, and he completed mission after mission that directly aided the Allied push against Nazi forces. What makes Hayden's story so striking is the double life he lived. To the world, he was a swashbuckling adventurer in films like Johnny Guitar and The Asphalt Jungle. But behind the scenes, he carried the weight of real espionage. Few in Hollywood knew just how dangerous his wartime work had been, because he rarely spoke about it. When audiences later watched him play tough outlaws or shady figures, they felt his authenticity. That was the edge Hayden brought. He wasn't acting tough. He had already been through ordeals most people couldn't dream of. Sterling Hayden wasn't just a Hollywood tough guy. He was a secret operative who had already lived a dozen thrillers before his first script ever reached his hands. Robert Montgomery. Robert Montgomery was the kind of actor audiences trusted, suave, polished, and endlessly confident. But beneath the smooth exterior was a man who had commanded real battleships in some of the most dangerous seas of World War II. When the war broke out, Montgomery didn't wait for a draft notice. He enlisted in the Navy and worked his way up to become a lieutenant commander. He took command of a patrol torpedo boat squadron, navigating small, fast craft through enemy-controlled waters. Later, he commanded a destroyer during the Normandy invasion, guiding his ship as shells and chaos filled the horizon. Montgomery wasn't content to stay in safe waters. He wanted to be where the fight was toughest. His leadership during the war earned him respect not only from his men, but also from his peers back home. When he finally returned to acting, audiences could sense the quiet strength behind his performances. He even brought his naval experience into Hollywood, serving as a consultant for war films and helping the industry capture the reality of life at sea. That dedication made him a bridge between two worlds, the fantasy of the silver screen and the harsh truth of the open ocean under fire. Robert Montgomery wasn't just a screen gentleman. He was a man who had actually steered ships through one of history's most brutal wars and lived to tell the tale. Glenn Ford. Glenn Ford's film career stretched across decades, with roles in classics like Gilda and The Big Heat. But Ford wasn't just another leading man. He had a long, active history in military service that spanned multiple wars. During World War II, Ford enlisted in the United States Marine Corps Reserve. He trained rigorously and built a foundation of discipline that would stay with him for life. After the war, when most actors hung up their uniforms for good, Ford kept his close ties to the armed services. He later joined the United States Naval Reserve, continuing his involvement for decades. Ford's military commitment wasn't symbolic. He trained with combat units and eventually worked in film units tasked with documenting military operations. By the time of the Vietnam War, he was still serving, using his Hollywood skills to create educational and training films that helped prepare younger generations for the realities of service. What made Ford stand out was his lifelong devotion. He rose to the rank of captain and received multiple commendations for his dedication. Hollywood may have known him as a leading man with an easy smile and commanding presence. But within the military, he was respected as a steady and dependable officer. That dual life gave Ford's screen roles extra weight. He wasn't simply pretending to be brave or disciplined. He had lived that life for decades, long after the credits rolled. Glenn Ford proved that service doesn't end when the cameras call cut. For him, it was a lifelong commitment that shaped both the man and the actor. George Kennedy. George Kennedy became famous later than most stars, but once he arrived, he never left. Audiences loved his towering frame and down-to-earth honesty in films like Cool Hand Luke and Airport. But Kennedy's credibility came from more than just acting chops. It came from a long stretch of real service. Kennedy spent 16 years in the U.S. Army, beginning during World War II. He served in combat engineering and communications roles, positions that required both technical skill and steady nerves. He worked his way up through the ranks and later became part of the Army's Armed Forces Radio and Television Unit, where he gained early experience that would eventually lead him to Hollywood. But before he ever touched a script, Kennedy had lived a life filled with the discipline and grit of service. He understood leadership, resilience, and sacrifice, because they weren't abstract concepts. They were daily realities. When Kennedy finally transitioned to acting, his time in the Army gave him a natural presence. He didn't need to fake authority or toughness. It radiated from him. That authenticity won him an Academy Award for Cool Hand Luke and turned him into one of Hollywood's most respected character actors. George Kennedy wasn't just a big man with a commanding voice. He was a veteran who had already lived a life of service before ever stepping onto a set. Charles Durning. Charles Durning was one of Hollywood's most beloved character actors, bringing warmth, humor, and grit to every role. But long before audiences knew him from Dog Day Afternoon or Tootsie, Durning lived through one of the most dangerous campaigns of World War II. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Durning was part of the first wave of troops landing on Omaha Beach. The chaos was indescribable. Sand, smoke, and constant danger. Many men didn't make it, but Durning somehow pushed forward. He was wounded multiple times as the Allies fought their way inland, and at one point, he was even captured. He later managed to escape and return to the fight, an ordeal that would haunt him for years. Those experiences shaped everything about Durning. He rarely spoke about the details, but he carried the scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of his life. When he stepped onto a movie set, that weight gave his performances a depth that no acting school could teach. Audiences sensed the truth in him. When Durning played soldiers, cops, or men under pressure, it wasn't imagination, it was memory. He knew what it felt like to face impossible odds, and that authenticity made him unforgettable. By the time he left this world, Charles Durning had earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and the admiration of millions who never realized the full extent of his heroism. He wasn't just one of Hollywood's greats. He was a survivor who carried history in his bones. So there you have it, 15 Hollywood icons who weren't just pretending to be tough. They were the real deal, trained fighters who had already lived through battles before the cameras ever rolled. The next time you watch one of their films, remember, the grit you see on screen wasn't crafted in makeup chairs. It was earned in the harshest realities of life. Which story surprised you most? Drop a comment, subscribe, and let's keep uncovering Hollywood's hidden truths.